Hello, I am an associate professor in the Department of History and Government here at Bowie State University, and I'm the director of the Women's Studies program. It's a minor program in the Department of History and Government. It's interdisciplinary, so people from various other disciplines and backgrounds can take women's studies, and it can take them into any of the other career paths that they may have.
That is amazing. So what was the inspiration for you to ask Miss Jones to come in for today and speak to us?
Well, I've known her for years. We went to graduate school together, and I have always known her to be a very prolific scholar and a very good speaker. I've actually asked her to come to Bowie several times, and she's always had some type of conflict or something. And so this time, she was like, oh yeah, I can do Wednesday the 8th. And I was like, hallelujah.
And of all the times for her to come, she would come during International Women's Day, right?
Well, yes, we in the Department of History and Government and the Women's Studies program, we do sponsor the official university Women's History Month commemoration program each year, and so we always try to have that around International Women's Day.
And before we row, I wanted to know, what is one lesson that you would like to give to our young black women here at Bowie State, just to help uplift them and help them to become better people?
Know who you are and know who you can be. And do not limit yourself, because there are no boundaries on what you can do and what you can become.
Thank you so much, Professor Brown.
Thank you.
For BSU TV, I am Micaiah Smith, and I'm being joined by Dr. Ida E. Jones, author of Mary McLeod Bethune in Washington, D.C., Education and Activism in Logan Circle. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Jones.
Thank you for having me. I'm really enjoying your campus.
So first, before we get started, I love to say Happy International Women's Day.
Yes, Happy International Women's Day to you, too. That's right, yes.
Thank you. So with you being interested in Mary McLeod Bethune, how do you think that today would be different without any of her accomplishments?
There'd be a huge difference. Her example on the international level as well as the national level of competency and advocacy, not just simply for African Americans, but for all marginalized people, as she said, is huge, because she set an example that other people replicated. As far as East India, she traveled, and as far as Africa, she travels to other countries, used her as an example in their native lands, as a woman speaking out. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia right now. We're impressed by people like that, to be heads of state, to be fearless women, to be feminine and a woman, and to still be a politician and not lose their womanness. She exemplified that, and that they modeled after her. So we would have had no example for that as African American women if she had not done what she did.
Wow. Well, I'm glad that she did do what she did. Well, with that being said, as an International Jones, you are a Cambridge native, am I correct?
Correct.
So what brought you here to the DMV area?
Howard University. I love Bowie. I have friends who went here, but I think just the general DMV area. Being in Massachusetts, we don't have the number of African American people. So when I came to Washington back in the 20th century, the whole city was black. The mayor was black. The police were black. It was a very unusual space to be in as an African American, to see such great opulence of black success, and also just the failure of those individuals who did not have the capacity to maintain or attain. So it really humbled you to say, well, look what I can be and look what I need not to be. And that was just a very sobering reality for me.
All right. Well, just like Miss Bethune, I noticed that you two have a lot of similarities. For example, you're both have deep roots into the empowerment of black women. You're both really big on education. So what was your inspiration for the study of Miss Mary McLeod Bethune?
That's a very good question. It came as a challenge. Initially, I wrote a book on a man named Kelly Miller and did a biography on him. He's an amazing individual. And a colleague of mine said, well, do something else. You should write a book about something else. There's nothing but Kelly Miller. That's all that matters to me. He said, no, somebody else. I said, well, Mr. Bethune has a house in Washington, D.C., and he had done a book on Frederick Douglass's home. I said, well, look at the home. So the book basically focuses on her life in the home, which is from 1943 to 1949. And she had done so much. I mean, she's fighting in Congress. She's fighting and protesting on the street. She's taking people in for tea. She's on Howard's campus. She's throughout the area, going to elementary schools. I met one woman who said that she came to her elementary school and encouraged her. And I'm just like, are you kidding? She said, and she spoke to me. And so her touching me was, and then Viola Haynes, she just passed away last year at 85 years old. And so that was amazing that I met somebody who actually met her. and people who got jobs because of her. And they said, yeah, I remember Mrs. Bethune, and she was like huge. She was an epic figure in their lives. So I think learning about her, and I thought I knew who she was. I knew the surface of who she was. I've gone at least maybe half a surface deep, but there's so much more about her to be explored, and I believe there's a biography that's being written about her, because we need to see how she lived her life with a child and a school, and just simply being a woman in a man's space. And then having the dark complexion. That's huge, because there is intra-racial strife. And at a time when it was not considered, polite for certain women to do that. So and she killed herself with dignity and integrity. And it's just, my jaw just drops when I think of her. And so between her and Harriet Tubman, we have such a rich, there's no failure, there's no option.
I'm an associate professor of history here at Bowie State University and director of the Women's Studies program here. Welcome to our official celebration of Women's History Month, sponsored by the Department of History and Government and the Women's Studies program. Some of you have already started with your repast, but we will have a small reception following our wonderful speaker this evening. And we will follow the program exactly as it is printed. Thank you. The first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York in July of 1848. At the time, women did not enjoy the full rights of citizenship and encountered difficulty in obtaining an education, owning property, having a job, or signing a contract after marriage. They did not have a voice and generally were thought of as property of their fathers and husbands. The convention called together like-minded women and men to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and the rights of women. The women organized the meeting around 18 sentiments modeled after the Declaration of Independence and introduced 11 resolutions to secure some measure of equality between the sexes. The 9th resolution brought forth the idea and necessity of a female's right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who spoke barely above a whisper when introducing this radical idea, stated, "I saw clearly that the power to make the laws was the right through which all other rights could be secured." Not all of the women supported this bold assertion, and Frederick Douglass had to encourage the passage of it. This struggle for the franchise lasted nearly 70 years before the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. Mainstream women fighting for voting rights, unfortunately, often did not take non-white women, into consideration, though women of color also fought for suffrage. Thus, Women's History Month is the outgrowth of the struggle for women's suffrage and workers' rights in the United States and women's activism globally. On the heels of the movement for women's liberation in the 1970s, the United Nations started to recognize March 8th as International Women's Day. The National Women's History Project successfully lobbied Congress to implement Women's History Week in 1981 to be celebrated around the time of March 8th. By 1987, the week turned into a month. This, 2017, is the 30th anniversary of Women's History Month, and it's a testament to women and their struggles and triumphs, often in the face of adversity. This anniversary has been deemed a day without women from the organizers of the Women's March. What better way to spend it than with our informative and very electrifying speaker, who happens to also be a very good friend of mine. Thank you and welcome to the program.
Excellent. Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood without suing or without special patronage, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me. This quote is taken from the 19th century educator and activist Dr. Anna Julia Cooper. I thought those words fitting for this occasion and celebration of Women's History Month and International Women's Day. Over 100 countries from around the world are celebrating the achievements and contributions that women have made from the political to the entertainment arena. I don't know if you had an opportunity to participate in any of the symbolic activities of A Day Without Women today, but I am hearing what we really already know. It would be impossible for this world to move forward without women. As we celebrate International Women's Day and Women's History Month, this also gives us an opportunity to tell the stories and accomplishments of women who recognize that with the celebration of women comes the acknowledgement that there is a continuous movement for social justice, meaning gender, race, class, sexuality in this country, and social movement and social justice across the world. African American women like Mrs. Bethune made it their life's mission to create spaces of freedom and life in every part of society: education, medicine, politics, religion, and public service, just to name a few areas. So again, welcome. Please take time to celebrate the sisters, aunts, daughters, mothers, wives, and sister friends in your life, because women are making history every day. Welcome.
Okay, I could read Dr. Jones' biography that's printed in your program, but since I know her a little bit, I'll give you a story. Now, I can't say anything about you without incriminating myself, so all I can say, and some of you who are in my class, you've heard this story before, so now you can put a face with the name. For those of you who are history and government majors, more than likely, you're going to graduate school because you're going to have to. And the best advice that I can give you is find yourself some good friends, okay? They will be there for you in all the good times and in the bad times. There were two people that got me through my graduate program. One is your speaker this evening, and the other was Uhura Williams. Every single day, I called one or both of them on the phone. We talked about class stuff, we talked about stupid stuff, we made fun of our professors and other things. All these things, again, to help us get through a very tough and rigorous program. Dr. Jones and I were in a Washington, D.C. history class taught by Dr. Elizabeth Clark Lewis. And in that class, it was a mixed class with graduate students and undergraduate students, and Dr. Clark Lewis was planning a book. And so she told the graduate students, she said, okay, graduate students, you all are going to prepare, I think it started out as like a 60-page paper. And somebody, I don't know who, had something to say about that 60-page paper. So the number kept going up and up and up until finally people decided to be quiet, and it stopped at 80 pages. And so the first installment was a 25-page paper, and it was due, we had class on Monday night, so it was due Monday night at 5 o'clock. Now, I'm a terrible procrastinator. Dr. Jones is better than I am, okay? She has learned how to work through her obstacles. I'm not so lucky. So it was Sunday evening. I was watching 60 Minutes, so that must have been around 7 o'clock or so. And she was sweeping her apartment. So we called each other on the phone, bring. I'm like, hey, Ida, what's up? She's like, hey, Tony, what's going on? I was like, oh, nothing much. I'm watching 60 Minutes. I said, what are you doing? She goes, oh, I'm sweeping. I said, okay. I said, is your paper finished? She's like, oh, no, not yet. She said, what about yours? I said, well, I'm about to start it in a few minutes. So it's less than 24 hours when it was due. So the next day, 5 o'clock, we both come to class. We both had 25 pages. Bam, on that desk. Okay? Actually, that was some of the best 25 pages I've ever written. In fact, I still use some of that research. I used it for a program I did with the National Park Service a couple weeks ago. But here's the thing. So we both can do that. Those of you who are history and government majors, you probably are learning how to do that. Now, we didn't research those papers that night. We had all that together. We wrote them. We wrote 25 pages because you can do that. Okay, but if you were trying to research and write it at the same time, my students who have a research essay coming up in a month or so, that's not going to work. Okay, and I use that, as an example that you don't necessarily have to do that because it's not something that's ideal to do, but it is something, a shared experience that, like I said, she's much better than I am, which is why she finished her degree before I did. But we've shared so many wonderful experiences. As a historian, you always want to have a very good friend that is an archivist and a very good friend that's a librarian as well, because they can find all sorts of things for you when you do your research. Dr. Davidson also knows the speaker very well. We went to a conference at MIT. The snow was up to here. I did not want to leave the hotel, but somebody made me go over to the conference, and I was like, oh my gosh, all this snow. But she's from Cambridge. Do not say she's from Boston. She's from Cambridge. And she was used to all that terrible weather. And we solved the world's problems in one evening. We don't remember what we said, which is why, we might be in the predicament that we're in now. But we solved the world's problems that evening. We just couldn't remember it the next morning. And so, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Ida Elizabeth Jones. She's going to talk to you today about one of the many books that she's written, and I'm sure that you will have an informative and exciting evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Burnham, for joining us. It's very rare that you find administrative spouses coming to these kinds of programs, so you all have a very special treat in her taking the time out of her personal schedule to join you. Even though she's an African-American woman, I'm sure she has tons of things she could be doing. So you want to, yes, please give her a round of applause. So I want to thank her. I also want to thank one of my church members that are in the crowd who's actually an employee here at Morgan, and I'm going to let her stay anonymous. Oh, excuse me, Morgan. Bowie, way off. We catch the MARC train every morning. I'm going to Morgan, so at Bowie here. She works with student affairs, so I will probably point her out later on. But I know it's after 5, and I know people have their homework assignments and places to be and things to do, so I'll be done in about 2.5 hours. Is that good? No, we're not going to spend that much time, but I think it's very important for us to take time to acknowledge someone such as Mrs. Bethune. So this discussion is about Mary McLeod Bethune in Washington, D.C., activism and education in Logan Circle. So who was Mary McLeod Bethune? She was the 15th child of her parents' 17 children. Unlike her older siblings, her parents, and her grandmother who she met, they were all born into enslavement. She was born in 1875 on July the 10th in Maysville, or a little bit outside of Maysville, South Carolina. Her parents were Samuel and Patsy McLeod, and they both were enslaved persons. So for her, slavery was very real, because she had relatives who had gone through that system. Although she herself did not feel the sting of the whip or the chattel designation, she understood the system very clearly because of blood. The McLeod family purchased land and lived on it, and they dubbed it the homestead in South Carolina. So before I get into all of this, I want you to kind of understand what that means. As we move further from the 20th century and move into the 21st century, the 19th century is like the 1600s. But it's very important for us to understand how important the legislation, the designation, and the self-imposed definition of African Americans still haunt us today. So when we look at individuals who are in either the White House or in state government or in local government, why they perceive African Americans a certain way has a very long history that goes back to a time in which we did not self-define, and definitions were superimposed, codified by law, and reinforced. So persons like Bethune allow us to have corrective lenses. Some of you might have had LASIK, or you might have glasses, you might have lenses. It corrects your vision. As I hurtle into cataracts and other things like that, I will have to have corrected vision too. So it's very important that we take persons like Mrs. Bethune to correct our vision, to understand that there was no voluntary migration of Africans to this country, although my ancestors did because they came from Barbados, but the mass amount of Africans that came into the Western Hemisphere were brought on slave ships. They were called chattel, so the chairs you're sitting in was equivalent to what they were, property, to be picked up, disposed of, and used. So I need to have you resonate that in your mind. Just very briefly to go back and recap, I did this particular book as a challenge by a colleague who said to me after my first book, you should do something on DC history. I said, well, Kelly Miller, of course. Kelly Miller is my heart. I love Kelly Miller. Now, you'll hear about him later. But I said, Kelly Miller's house. He's like, no, enough about Kelly Miller. Pick somebody else. He had just written a book on Frederick Douglass's home in Anacostia. And this particular press that I worked with do local history studies. So for those of you who are government majors who have book ideas, let's talk, because there are publishers looking for your ideas who will help you get it published. Okay, so we really need to make those stories told. So I said, what about Mrs. Bethune? I said, she has a house in D.C. and no one knows about her. I thought I knew who Mrs. Bethune was till I did this book. This woman's life is amazing. This is just a scintilla from 1943 to 1949 in her life. She was born in 1875. She dies in 1955. So I'm not including the vast amount of her life. So I'm just doing a very small sliver of her life. And this particular book of nearly 200 pages is just those 7 years. Okay, so I need to remind you of that. These are her parents, Samuel and Patsy McLeod. This image is held by the Florida State Archives, and it's a rendering. It's a chalk and pencil rendering of her parents. This is the cabin that the McLeods built. Of her 17 siblings, I believe there were over 10 boys. And everything they did was to hew the logs, which means to cut the tree down, to shave the tree off, and to create a log cabin. This is very poignant for her because what happens is that Mrs. Bethune had been impressed with windows because the log cabin didn't have windows, they have shutters. And for those of you who've gone camping, shutters are basically wooden slats that cover the hole that's called a window. So when she went into town with her father and saw houses that had windows that you could sit inside and look outside, she became very enamored with being able to own property one day that her parents could sit inside and look outside. So when you to look at a window the next time and you're trying to clear off your window in your car, think of those simple things that we take for granted that a generation of people did not have familiarity with in their principal life. Her first school lesson was she was impressed by a woman named Miss Wilson. And a lot of the early teachers in South Carolina, as well as the Deep South, were church missionaries who went to educate, quote, the ex-slaves, as well as whites that were also ignorant and unlearned. So they weren't just going to be doing it for us. We were the largest population, but all other persons who were basically non-literate were allowed to come and attend those schools. Miss Wilson impressed upon her John 3:16. Of course, God so loved the world that whoever believeth in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. And that whoever really resonated with Mrs. Bethune when she understood who her grandmother was, who she was, who her parents were, that there was something bigger than herself that saw her as special and loved. And that was the way she chose to live her life, that everybody had value and worth, irrespective of your social standing. And as a woman during the 19th century, as an African-American woman of slave parentage, she was very much denied the opportunity to experience some things, but she realized education was the great equalizer. Most of you were in school to learn, to get a degree, to get the bomb job, to get the bomb husband, or whatever you're in here to do. But what you get when you get your degree, they can't take out of your head. The tests and the papers that Dr. Brown gives you and Dr. Walker gives you is just a paper, get it done. But when you look back on your life, what you learn, how you learn and how you think, you're one person, there are 10 people that would want to be in your seat who have capacity as good, if not greater than yours. So you need to really value your seat for your parents, for your siblings, and for those coming up behind you, for the immigrants that are coming into this country for the same level of freedom that you have to learn and be free to learn as a girl, as an African American, as a working class person. So it's very important that you kind of walk in humility, and that's why I love that quote by Mrs. Bethune. Beyond Maysville, Miss Wilson located Mary Christman, who was a Quaker seamstress who sought to use her earnings to benefit a needy student. So the interracial connection between white and blacks really helped, and that this woman was able to be philanthropic and help Mrs. Bethune to further her education. So she eventually goes to a Scotia Seminary in Concord, North Carolina, and in 1887, with tears and prayers, handshakes and clapping, Mary left the homestead, her family home, the only place she had known and lived, for a journey beyond the world of Maysville. Most of you might be Maryland natives and therefore have not traveled outside of Maryland. Coming here from Massachusetts was a shock to me, being in the South, and people talking slow and moving slow. And this is not even the Deep South, this is the Upper South, So at any rate, I encourage you to take trips if you can. If you have an exchange program to visit other states, other countries, how other people live. I've been to Cape Town, South Africa, and to see poverty in its most profound sense it's amazing. We don't have poverty in this country. We have greed that makes people have less. But when you see poverty, it's amazing. It's amazing. So off to Moody Bible Institute is where she goes. Mrs. Bethune wanted to be a missionary. She wanted to take her chocolate self and go to Africa to be with other African people to spread the word of God, which is the Christian doctrine. Now, we're always told that Africans came into this country tabula rasa, as a blank slate, and that Europeans had to write and inscribe value on them. That is a lie. African people came with memory, they came with culture, they came with languages and heritage that was embedded in their mindset. The way we name our children, to the way they named things, to the dances they did, all was embedded in a pre-American mindset. So she wanted to see, where do black people come from? We don't come from chains and slavery. The Bible says that there's a place called Ethiopia. There's a place that's called Africa. I need to go there and see, what do my people look like? Unfortunately, she was denied that capacity to go, and she eventually was able to meet someone else who helped her go into education. We always see Mrs. Bethune as a gray-haired woman. This is her as a young woman in the 1890s. And I guess in the 19th century, they call it wasp waist, a very wasp, a nice narrow waist. And she was rather stylish. This was kind of haute couture in that day and age. And I thought it was a very nice picture also at the Florida State Archives. The disappointment transformed her life. When she completed Moody Bible School in Chicago, she did apply to the missionary board of the Presbyterian Church and asked to be assigned somewhere in Africa, not Liberia, or she didn't ask for a specific country, she just said somewhere there. And they answered, the mission board said no, there were no available opportunities for Negro missionaries in Africa. Disheartened, she returned to Maysville and taught as an assistant to Miss Wilson, where she remained in Maysville for 1 year. She requested another assignment from the Presbyterian Board of Education and was reassigned to the Haynes Institute in Augusta, Georgia. At the Haynes Institute, it was founded by a woman named Lucy Craft Laney. And Lucy Laney was a slave person. She was born in the 1850s. She opened a school to teach other people how to read. And when she met Mrs. Bethune, she says to her, your missionary field is our people in education. That is your missionary field, to educate our people. So she meets Lucy Craft Laney, and she becomes a mentor and friend for the greater part of her life. And it was founded, she was born in 1864, got my date wrong, but it's 1864. Lucy Laney's school provided a living laboratory for Mrs. Bethune to see the transformation education made. If any of you are watching Mercy Street, that was on PBS, you have a situation in which someone's being taught, and she's talking about different kinds of experiences around the world. Can you imagine never knowing how to read? Or maybe let's say never knowing how to use a smartphone, which is my generation and back. My father just got his first one at 83, and he has kind of muffin hands, so he can't even hold it, and then he's pressing all the, So my nephew, who's 16, let me show you, Jonesy. This is how you do it. You swipe lightly. So this is the level of technology and literacy for my father because he does not understand the literacy. He appreciates the outcome. I can get food, I can get a cab. He understands the outcome, but this is the level of literacy for him. So the same thing for enslaved persons and those who were after emancipation. They were learning a level of literacy. They knew it meant something, but they did not have the cognizant disability to understand all that, ability to understand that. So once again, while she was with Mrs. Laney, she heard that whosoever again. So these enslaved or formerly enslaved women, men, children, working class and poor whites were coming to learn. They understood there was something about these things called words on pages that do something to your understanding. And your sense of citizenship was attached to your literacy. So if you understood who you were as a citizen, then you had a level of pride in being part of, quote, the Republic. And that was very huge for African American people. Here's Mrs. Bethune in 1910. Once again, that's all her hair, y'all. That's no weave, that's no Hawaiian bee or whatever, yaki, whatever y'all put. That's all her hair. Okay, so we can grow hair. And there was no perm, so this is her natural hair. Maybe a little heat. But at any rate, I think it's very good. And these pictures really, look at her eyes. Can you imagine what she's thinking? She's probably seeing you here in the 21st century she'll never meet. But the standard of her living would allow you to live beyond. So we always have to take that in perspective. You're living for somebody else, not just simply yourself. So she goes back to South Carolina after she meets Lucy Craft Laney, and she meets a lovely man named Albertus Bethune. He was a fine chocolate man. I show you, you'll see his son's picture when you see it, and he was gorgeous. They met in church, and I said he was attentive, gallant, handsome, and taught her how to ride a bicycle. Okay, because women had to wear dresses. They didn't have pants and all these other, so he taught her how to ride a bicycle. Mrs. Bethune was a teacher, was teaching, and left the profession because it was underpaid. He left because he was underpaid. So he was also a teacher. And he told her, good luck to you in teaching. I need to make some money. So he goes into insurance sales. They court for 1 year and they get married. And they get married in 1898 by the Reverend J.C. Watkins, who was a principal of Kendall. Within the first year of marriage, they moved back to Georgia, to Savannah, Georgia. And in 1899, they have their first son, Albertus McLeod Bethune, Jr. Her grandson is still living. He's 94 years old, or 96 years old. He's the only son of Albertus. And he's a librarian at Bethune-Cookman, retired librarian at Bethune-Cookman. So the Lord spoke to Mrs. Bethune in dreams and visions. And she had a dream where she was standing on the brink of a water bank or the edge or the coast. And when she looked behind her, there was a great army of young people coming up after her. And the pastor interpreted her dream as being symbolic of her destiny to be a school builder where thousands of young people would pass through her hands. She embraced that vision and departed with her 9-month-old son to Florida. She never formally divorced her husband. He left and she left, and there was no malice between the two of them. The interesting thing about this is that he gave his blessing for her to leave, and that was it. and he encouraged her to do what she had to do. So she is a single woman with very little resources going to Florida on the whim of a dream that she had interpreted as opening a school. So on October 4th, 1904, Mrs. Bethune declared the Daytona Literary and Industrial School for the Training of Negro Girls in session with 5 students. And you see their names there. The inaugural school opened day one with prayer asking for the Lord's blessing and a hymn, Leaning on the Everlasting Arm. The early faculty was composed of older women who could read and were willing to be volunteers. The children were daughters of the working women whose chief concern had been the safeguard of their daughters. So this is the Daytona Industrial School that you see here. Mrs. Bethune is center with the lovely hair. Her son was kind of brought into the school, even though he's not pictured there, but he was also included in the school. So this lets you know that she is the founder and principal, and at the very bottom it says, "Is it nothing to you, all you that pass by?" The first pupils from this humble beginnings were the girls that she had. She eventually was able to secure some land for about $1.25 and pay it off. So there you see on the right-hand side or your left-hand side them doing manual labor in field work. So the whole idea of manual labor, some of us think that's beneath us. Nothing's beneath you if you can make money off of it and generate a sense of business and industry for yourself. So let's not despise those who you see doing maintenance. They might be going to school to get their degrees. So everyone needs to kind of take into consideration how you get to your goal, and your end line is going to be your path, but I'm not going to despise that path that you've been given. Mrs. Bethune sought greater funding sums for her school, and she met her first large donor, a white man by the name of James M. Gamble of Procter & Gamble. Has anyone heard of that company? In Cincinnati, Ohio. And Gamble had a winter house in Daytona, the Daytona, Florida area. She wrote him a letter about the school and requested that he meet her, and they met, and eventually she showed him the land she wanted to buy. It was called Hell's Hole, an area on the fringes of a black settlement. And Gamble employed his own attorney, who contributed legal services without cost. And when she brought him there, and he just saw basically a trash heap or the ends of the city, and she goes, "Do you see what I see?" He said, "What is it you see? Because I can tell you what I see, and it's not going to be the same." She said she saw her school, the buildings, the library, the hospital, all of the dormitories. She saw all of this in her vision, looking on what was a dump in a trash heap in that part of Florida. She travels to New York and meets a woman named Frances Kaiser, who operated the White Rose Mission Settlement Home. I'm sure those of you who've had Dr. Brown's class know what a settlement home is in terms of what they did. It was kind of a transitory housing for women. Women did not have the luxury of traveling freely without being either assaulted or attacked, and we take it lightly, but we need to be very careful when no means no. But back in that time, you should be traveling without escort. And even if you were 5 girls together, where's the male escort? And so even Ida B. Wells had to fight that stereotype off of being called a prostitute because she was often by herself. She carried a gun. So you want to bring it, she's going to send it back across the table. So the whole idea of your physical well-being, now that we talk about it, this has been a long history for African American women in general, and women in particular, to have the mobility of movement, freedom of movement. So it's very important that you safeguard that, and no means no, and make that, don't toy with that, with men or women nowadays. Before it was just simply a heterosexual thing, but now it's far more nuanced. So at any rate, she meets in New York this woman, Frances Kaiser, and apparently she's introduced to the NACWC. Does anyone know what NACWC stands for? Not Dr. Brown or Dr. Walker? Yes, ma'am. The National Association of Colored Women, yes, and I have something for you after that. I'm going to give you a copy of my book because you answered that question. So there are prizes, so stay awake. There's a chicken in the back, but I got prizes, okay? So just so you know. Pardon me? You were thinking of that? Well, your telepathic thought went to her, so y'all can fight it out in the back. I'm not going to get involved in that. Thank you, young lady. There's something waiting for you. All righty. So at any rate, so she joins the NACWC, which is the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, founded in Massachusetts in 1896. At any rate, Mrs. Bethune served as the state president. They had almost like the federal government. There were states and there were regions, and then there was a national. So Mrs. Bethune rose to leadership as the state federation president in the Georgia and Florida area. In 1924, she was elected the national president, and she held that position until 1928. During her presidency, she crusaded for appropriate housing for delinquent girls, as well as the idea of having the right kinds of officials working with them in prisons, because you could be taken up for vagrancy. You all call it hanging out or chilling. That was called vagrancy, and you could be arrested for that. Talking back or sassing someone, you could be arrested for that. And when you got into the prison, you were now their property, because what happens behind those walls we don't see. So the whole idea of juvenile delinquency, she wanted to stem the tide of women getting in there, but then now the fair treatment of them inside so they get reformed and not to have recidivism where you're going back into that system. Bethune secured a defunct jail in Ocala, which is in Florida, and secured a matron to maintain the facility. So she opened up her own juvenile delinquency facility. One girl nearly died of an asthmatic attack on the campus. She opened up her own hospital. Because Jim Crow was very stringent, they would not treat African Americans, nor they would treat them fairly. She countered with opening up her own facilities. Okay, the facility served as a classroom, providing the girls training, guidance, and protection. Bethune implored the NACW members to recognize discrimination and miseducation as a threat to the citizenship of all of us. And thus the women needed to take the measures to secure proper education for Negro people, ensuring that they dismantle segregation and the lack of community. Here is a very lovely picture at the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. Mrs. Bethune is seated in the middle to your left, in the middle. And then beside her is Lucy Craft Laney. Now, if I had a pointer, the woman that's behind, I can't even reach it here, but let me see if I put my shoe back on. The lady here, then you see Mrs. Bethune, and then you see Lucy Craft Laney. This lady behind her with a white collar. Does anybody know who that woman is behind her with the white collar on her dress? Thank you for the pointer. It had to be green. Couldn't it be pink?
It was green.
Okay. All righty. So this is Mrs. Bethune. This is Lucy Craft Laney. And does anybody know who this woman here is? I get some good names. They're women in history, but they're not that time period. No, not Madam C.J. Walker, not Ida B. Wells. Nope. Not Ida B. Wells. That's going to be a really hard one. It's just random. But this woman here is Charlotte Hawkins Brown. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this picture is very epic because you have Bethune founding a school, Haynes founding a school, and Charlotte Hawkins Brown founding a school. Had Nannie Helen Burroughs been in there, all four African American women that founded schools would have been in one particular picture. So this picture is considered very celebratory because you have a banker here. I think that's Mary Magdalene. There's some women here, I forget all the names, so see, I need to take the test myself. At any rate, so there are businesswomen and educators in this picture. But this is the most epic picture where you have these three women together. Had there been Nannie Helen Burroughs, that would have been a very remarkable picture to have four school founders. This woman was born in 1864. She's born in 1875. She's born in 1883. So you have different generations of black women, all Southern born, coming together in this one picture. So that was very profound, and that's at the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. So at any rate, as she is growing in the NACWC, they're going to have a problem with her because, like me, I wanted to stay president forever of ABWH, and they eventually move you out. They have term limits, and they put you out. So Mrs. Bethune was kind of asked to leave the NACWC, but not prior to her meeting the Roosevelt women. You've heard about Eleanor Roosevelt, and then her mother-in-law were also at this women's meeting. They had a National Council of Women meeting. And Eleanor Roosevelt, when she was the wife of the then senator of New York, she invited all the women to come, even the Colored Women's Club. So Mrs. Bethune was a very dark-complected woman of a very ebon complexion, and she kind of stuck out. So the Roosevelt women, and they looked at, well, is she serving? There's no tray. Why is she in this room? We don't, it's like a skunk walked in here, like, okay, you have four legs, but you're not a mammal, so why are you here? So nevertheless, she was approached by the Roosevelt women and sat at their table. And that began the nature of a very long relationship between the Roosevelt women and Mrs. Bethune. Now, the interesting thing about Eleanor Roosevelt and Mrs. Bethune that you need to understand is they were not considered physically attractive by the state of their time. They were not demure. They did not have quote, polite or small features. And they were very intelligent. Men are afraid of brain. Why are men afraid of women's brain? Come on. I'm looking at you, Dr. Miller. Why are you afraid of women's brain? I'm scared of her. So at any rate, because of their brilliance and because of their physical stature not being appealing, they found a sense of sisterhood with each other because they were outliers. Now, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt marries very well, and she marries a man named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he becomes the President of the United States. He also faced term limits, but at any rate. And then Mrs. Bethune was also very mammoth in her career. But those two women, because of their outlierness, being outside of it and seeing the broader picture of human rights, not just women's rights, but human rights, they found a sense of sisterhood with each other. So if you ever get a chance to kind of look at Mrs. Roosevelt, you might see her differently in terms of how she was mistreated by her own people. And she was a very pedigreed individual. But she also talked about the pain that she had about being who she was and looking. She was 6 feet tall. And so she had large feet, and she was just too much. And then she was very intelligent. Oh, way too much. Turn that down. So they became very close friends. And Roosevelt's radical approach to social and political issues provided Bethune and eventually the NCNW an audience with the president because they remained friends from New York all the way to the White House. Their friendship afforded NCNW with an annual White House meeting with Mrs. Bethune and a federal appointment. So now we get to 1318 Vermont Avenue, but I got to bring you back a bit. So what happens is that when Mrs. Bethune is put out of the NACWC to be general member, no longer leadership, she decides to create an organization of her own. Not to eclipse or to demean the NACWC, but to be able to provide her a platform to do what she wanted to do. So at 1318 Vermont Avenue, and these pictures are from the Mary McLeod Bethune home, you'll see here that there's been some damage to the photograph. As an archivist, I got to point that out. That's the original. It's kind of sad. But this woman here is Eleanor Holmes Roosevelt. Then, not Eleanor Holmes, Eleanor Roosevelt. This here is, once again, Charlotte Hawkins Brown, the other school founder. There's Bethune, and who's this guy here? I think that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I think that's the president. So they're standing before this property that she purchased in Washington, D.C. And here's Eleanor Roosevelt giving a keynote or remarks at the opening of the House in 1943. So Mrs. Bethune comes to Washington, D.C. in the 1930s. We know that Washington, D.C. is not just south of you, but it's a very unique city. The federal government is there, but it's also a local community of over 140 distinct neighborhoods that are there. And so there's culture. The Depression is what brought Mrs. Bethune to Washington, D.C. for government work. Here she is in 1934 going to the inauguration. Now, she's probably in her late 50s at this juncture, and she'd had some dental work. So I noticed when she got the dentures, it made the lower part of her mouth protrude. So when you saw the younger pictures of her, she didn't always look like that. So take care of your temples, people, as you get older. As I face my own dental challenges and my own structural issues, let me tell you, keep it light, tight, and right while you're young so that it can grow nice when you get older. Just say it, because the years go by fast. And sexy won't stay with you always. Gotta maintain it. But at any rate, so Black Washington, D.C. was a racially segregated city. So there was a white Washington and there was a black Washington. And there were lines of demarcation that were very clearly understood by locals as well as anyone visiting. And into those categories, there was pedigreed natives, neo-natives, middle-class poor, educated, uneducated, fair and dark complexioned, homeowners, alley dwellers. Anything to be a difference was going to be a dividing line. And you see that kind of balkanizing, they call it, again, happening with us. College educated, not college educated. HBCU, PWI, Greek, non-Greek, rich, not rich, north. So we need to stop that. And it's human nature to kind of segregate into what's familiar. But at the end of the day, when we eventually have tribes of one, then what do we have? You know, that's a kind of very sad place to live. So Black Washington was very gentrified and very stratified. That's the Washington Mrs. Bethune came into. In 1934, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 7086, inaugurating the National Youth Administration under the direction of Aubrey Williams. The NYA sought to prevent human erosion among the American youth. You'll hear that conversation. We're always concerned, what are the youth doing? Are they going to be buying into this? So we're always afraid of these kinds of marches and protests. What are the youth doing? Because the rest of us are too invested with mortgages and maintaining our health care that we don't have the vision you have. So if we pollute the planet now, those of you in your teens and 20s, you're inheriting a polluted planet. The rest of us are kind of looking at so many hours till the final call and we're gone out of here. So as a result, it's very important you remain vigilant and use your citizenship and your vote to articulate that the world be clean, that we have clean water, that we have fair jobs and other things like that. So the NYA sought to do that. Now the NYA sought to deal with 16 years old to 25 years old through vocational training, scholarships, and job placement. The investment of the youth provided future generations with practical skills. Of the 21 million youth, nearly 7 million were out of school, unemployed, or on relief. This is the 1930s. And if you look at our time right now, it's almost very parallel and comparable to what people cannot do. Everyone cannot afford to go to college. Everyone cannot afford a, quote, decent job. And a lot of these jobs that people are doing in McDonald's or waitressing, or whatever, they're going to go away. Technology is moving those things to obsolescence. So you're going to have some trade, some skill, some ability to have income. And it's going to be beyond something that's simply manual. If you can do hair, if you can cook food, find a second stream of income. Word to the wise as I look at my own membership towards ARP. But at any rate, so the NYA leadership, in 1936, her first report impressed upon FDR that the Minority Affairs Office needed to get some attention. She used the appointment to benefit black students as well as HBCUs because there was federal funding for certain categories and she was going to make sure that everybody got a piece of that pie. In 1940, she understood her political capital. The election of 1940 afforded her leverage with the Democratic Party on behalf of the black vote. Her organizational influences with the NAACP, the Urban League, and the NCNW elevated her from simply an educator to a self-appointed politician and race representative. She's the only woman in her era that stands out like that on the national level. She's basically what Frederick Douglass was to the 19th century, she was to the 20th century. Mrs. Bethune was that kind of a power broker. She made it known that she was not a puppet of the FDR administration, nor was she in agreement with all of his policies, and she vocalized that in the black press and into his face directly during the meetings. So she participated in local protests. She understood the local, the regional, and the national, and eventually the international need of how this human rights struggle is all linked together. She participated in local protests, and she participated with the new Negro Alliance. There was a thing called People's Drugstore. It was now like CVS or Rite Aid. And they operated 44 stores in the black neighborhood, but there were disproportionately few black workers. So the NNA was going to protest and hit the pocketbook. And you find when you hit someone's pocketbook, they tune up and pay some attention. So as a result, William Hasties, who was a lawyer, was also part of this. And you have Mrs. Bethune here protesting with his William Hasties' wife beside her, saying no colored clerks in colored neighborhoods, then stay out. If our money's green but our black hands aren't well enough to hire, then stay out of our neighborhoods. So you're seeing that as being a threat of her conversation. Because what does employment do? It elevates you out of a certain level of poverty and gives you a sense of ownership of community and citizenship. She was always making sure to press those issues. At the advent of the NCNW, so you have the national situation is the Great Depression. We're not in World War II yet. And so she's been put out of the NACWC. She's trying to figure out how do we galvanize our strength. So the national impact of the Depression quickened in Mrs. Bethune the need for a national clearinghouse for black women. The entrenched segregation directed New Deal relief along racial lines with specific regions. A national black women's organization with national influence could sway the balance of provisions afforded black people. Bethune saw racism as a national problem. She concluded that black people must join forces with other colored people, people of color, worldwide, while fighting for integration in America. So she links what's, let's say, happening in the Sudan. She's going to link what's happening in Jamaica or South America with the black struggle here. So oppression, we call it intersectionality. I'm sure your professors have mentioned that lovely term. Mrs. Bethune was an intersectionalist before we coined that term. So she was linking the freedom struggle here with the freedom struggle in other parts of the world. So on December the 5th of 1935 in New York City, Bethune called together the leadership of 10 organizations and discussed the urgent need. And on July 25th of 1936, she incorporated in Washington, D.C., at Dean Slow of Howard University, founder of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated of Howard University. She incorporated at that address the NCA. Do we have any AKAs in here? Any other AKAs in here? Okay, I see the tan. I got it now. Slow on the uptake. I'm of the blue persuasion myself, but that's another conversation another time. So to unite national membership organizations in the NCNW, she was going to unite them. So it would be like, they say, American salad. So the carrot would have the carrot and the apple. All of it would be individual, but collectively nutritional. So she was going to unite them for political, economic, and educational activities and institutions to serve as a clearinghouse, to disseminate information, to plan, and to initiate and carry out projects. So we're not competing with each other. Okay, I'm not sure if anyone's had a Charlie horse in their hand or any part of your body, and that muscle goes off, and the rest of them is trying to, when one goes off, we're now all going to lose, because you're zapping our strength. But if we were united as a fist, you could have much more effectiveness in terms of that, and that's where she was going with that. The NCNW chipped away at segregation through living above the fray. They held workshops, conferences, they wrote articles in journals, they held award ceremonies, and they invited international leaders from around the world to come and discuss the problems in their country, the solutions that they've used that have helped to basically inform African American struggles for freedom. As early as the 1940s, Bethune seeded the idea of a national headquarters in Washington, D.C. In 1943, the NYA closed. There was a Republican push to basically defund it. And they defunded it, and so now she was without a job. But she still was not without work, because the NCNW became her passion. Mind you, she's still running her school in Florida. Bethune's search for property had met the requirements befitting her influence. She didn't still want to be anywhere in Washington, D.C. She wanted the cathedral or the temple or what have you of the NCNW to be worthy of Negro women worldwide. And of course, her status as a power broker in Washington, D.C. She wasn't going to be in no alley dwelling in the back of some neighborhood nobody knows. She is in the Logan Circle neighborhood, which is a rather posh neighborhood within the shadow of the White House. So she would walk with her stride over to the White House. She would walk to U Street. Some of you might have heard of U Street in Black Broadway. So she was in a space that was very electric and alive, and she wanted to be in that neighborhood. Oh, she could walk to Howard also. So as a result, that's where she was. So she purchased the house for $15,000. Of that $15,000, she received a check from a man named Marshall Fields. Those of you might not remember, there were department stores before Macy's became everything. Every state had their own. And in Chicago, it was Marshall Fields. In Massachusetts, it's Jordan Marsh and Filene's Basement. But Marshall Fields, after listening to her, wrote a $10,000 check. I don't know what kind of words she was spitting, but I would love to have seen that script, because I could use some coin like that myself. For the race, for the race. Okay. Anyway, so here she is giving her address in front of the house on Vermont Avenue, where they still are. Here she is with other members at the dedication. And I'm sure Dr. Brown and Dr. Walker know who this woman is here. Does anyone know who this woman here is? Okay, now that's another kind of, I'll probably do a date one with you all, but this woman here is Dr. Dorothy Ferebee. She was the second president of the NCNW. It's very important. We don't think it went from Bethune to Haight. There were 3 presidents between them, or 2 presidents actually. So it goes from Bethune to Dr. Dorothy Ferebee, who was her personal medical doctor. She was an OBGYN, and she also served as a personal medical doctor of Mrs. Bethune. And then it goes to a woman named Vivian Carter Mason. And they both happen to be women of AKA. But then Dr. Haight comes in, and she's a Delta lady, and so it becomes Delta run up until now, for the most part. So it's very interesting to see how she brought the church women's groups, the sororities and all the fraternal organizations to work the NCNW as equal organizations. But those who had greater membership and greater strength, she would lean on them stronger because you have more. Okay. Here she is now in the archives. What Mrs. Bethune did also at the infancy of the NCNW was realize they had to document themselves. There were no libraries that had African American books. There were no places where African American literature, Negro literature existed. So she set out to create an archive and document themselves. She had all the clubs send in from their states, literature by authors in your state, dolls from your state, photographs from your state. So materials would come to Washington, D.C. that would be organized and maintained and be able to have the world see how the Negro woman represents herself. This woman here with the scarf on is a woman named Sue Bailey Thurman. And her mother was an educator, and she gave almost about $4,000 out of her own wallet to help fund it. Her husband was a man named Howard Thurman. Some of you might have heard of him. He was a great theologian and mystic and such. And this lady here, her name escapes me, I feel so bad. She was one of the students of Mrs. Bethune in 1904. She stayed with Mrs. Bethune her entire life and dedicated her life to Mrs. Bethune's work. Here you are with the NCNW's dedicating the archives. And in this room right now, the house is closed right now for renovations and repair, but this is the main room. And I'm just wondering how they can fit all those people in there. I can't see it, but I guess it worked. And so she's actually having a dedication service of the archives. Then she also started a thing called the Honor Roll. During World War II, she realized women were not getting the kind of attention they deserved. Historically, they hadn't received it either. So she created her own award ceremony and would designate between 15 and 25 women that she would give awards to thank them for their service for women and humanity. So in this picture here, she's giving awards to a woman named Helen Gagan Douglas, who was a congresswoman out of California. She also gave one to Eleanor Roosevelt and Mabel Stoppers. I mean, you name any woman, and there are some that are greater names and lesser names, but I have all 70 of them in the book, and it talks about who these women were, and you'll be surprised about the great expanse women did work in this country, and they don't get it. There's one woman here, Lois Maylou Jones, a notable artist who would do a lot of illustrations for her and such like that. So they're great, and this is Helen Gagan Douglas over here, who was the congresswoman, like Ronald Reagan. She was an actress and became a congresswoman. And so she does these great things. And then there's another one, Polly Murray, a lawyer. You might have heard about her, Polly Murray. She's in there also as a young woman. So Mrs. Bethune wanted to immortalize these people. This woman here is a woman named Carol Bryce, and she's actually a soprano. You've heard about Marian Anderson not being able to sing at Lincoln Memorial. Well, when Truman wanted to initiate a civil rights agenda, Mrs. Bethune wanted to plan a concert. I want to say it was at, not the DAR, but maybe Constitution Hall, I forget which one. But she wanted to have a freedom concert, and Mrs. Bryce was going to be the singer. They denied Mrs. Bethune the venue because of Jim Crow. So she had to move the concert to New York. She moves the concert to New York. They lose a huge amount of money on it, but she wanted to have a freedom concert to kind of, on 10 years hence, since the Marian Anderson debacle, she wanted to celebrate, look how far the country had come. And still, because of Jim Crow in Washington, she could not have her concert there. So Mrs. Bryce had to go to New York and sing, and she receives a certificate of honor from Mrs. Bethune regarding that. She also entertained international people. This is a delegation of women from Haiti. So she understood that Haiti, like Ethiopia for the African continent, was the country that fought for its independence and basically became a sovereign nation. So Haiti for African Americans held a very strong remark of how fighting and unity can create a country for themselves. Unfortunately, Haiti has been basically maltreated by European forces since its freedom in the 1790s, and they still fought, and they're still fighting. But Haiti was very symbolic for Mrs. Bethune. She visited there, and they actually gave her an award there. She also hosted librarians, so when they wouldn't let her go to Africa, she brought Africa to herself, and she brought the Caribbean to herself. You can tell she was a very stately woman. She has her pearls on, and she has her help and all the lovely china and fixings for that. She also held baseball games and did baseball fundraisers. That's a ball in her hand with the mink on her wrap, and she's throwing out the first ball. So the Bethune ball games basically were efforts where she would have the Negro Leagues come out and have these benefit games to celebrate black economy, because it's black dollars in black hands, to celebrate black sportsmanship, because there are black athletes playing with black spectators watching, and to celebrate themselves. This was now the stadium that was called Griffith Stadium in Washington, D.C. is where Howard University Hospital is right now, but it was a stadium that could seat 10,000 people there, and so she celebrated her birthday games there. There was also a Miss Homestead Grays. So we also love beauty and pageantry. So this here is Harriet West, who's the first major in the wax, and she's being pinned with an honorable badge at the Griffith Stadium. The interesting thing about this is that it also was allowing us to celebrate ourselves and to see positive examples of ourselves. She gave tickets to the veterans. She would give tickets to newspaper seller boys or young men that were selling the newspaper, and she really believed in that. This man here is a man named Posey. I think it's Cumberland Posey. Right here, he's an African American, and he actually owned the Homestead Grays. They came out of Pennsylvania, out of Pittsburgh, and he brought them to Washington, D.C., and he was the sports commissioner at the time, and this is them doing their business with the ticket sales and such like that. These are all pictures from the Mary McLeod Bethune home. She also was about beauty and industry. So here she is with the United Beauty School Owners and Teachers Association, helping them getting themselves ensconced and established, and trading dollars. So we had black hair, everything was separate. So what we live in now in the world of integration, it wasn't just simply a kind of black store. The whole world was black. The dentist was black, the bank was black, everything was black. And to circulate that dollar within the community and to apprentice young people was very important because it gave you skills to survive. And so the beauty school, she was very much into that. And that went all the way to manufacturing and such. This I found very interesting is that you have in this picture, you have Mrs. Bethune here. Beside her is a woman named Mary Church Terrell. Does anyone know who Mary Church Terrell was? You cannot answer. You were. Oh my. Okay. Well, I think you all might have to pull Dr. Miller's coattail and ask one day who she was. She was a very amazing individual, and I would love to have when you do your comments to give some information about her. And now here is a young Dorothy Height. I'm working on a work now looking at this idea of a human bridge because you have these 3 generations of women, 3 generations of experience overlapping one another with some level of inspiration and so on and so forth. And of course, look how they're dressed. They're dressed very stately. I believe that's a government office building that they're in front of. Here's another picture, and then you have your young Dorothy Height here. And I think this is young Dorothy Height. I think this might be Jean, I forgot her last name. She was a professor at Howard, I believe. Jean Noble, I think that might be Jean Noble there. And so some of these people I met in the winter of their lives. So it's interesting to see how that, someone who had relatives who were enslaved, who met them. It's just very chilling to know how history, even though it seems long, is not that long when you can meet people who live through an experience. Now this is where I wrap up kind of, sort of. This is her son, Albertus Bethune. He looks just like his dad. That's a pretty good-looking man right there, if I must say. At any rate, he had one son, and Mrs. Bethune literally adopted him, legally adopted him, and raised him. And then here is Arabella Dennison. That's her name. Arabella Dennison is a student from 1904 who stayed with her the entire life. This whole activity was from a radio show called This Is Your Life. And this was a show where they would basically bring somebody on and they would play vignettes. And it would be a voice from your past. Oh, that's my 3rd grade teacher, Miss Johnson. They'd come out, hello, it's your life. So at any rate, this man, Ralph Edwards, who's leaning over the table talking to her, developed this radio program for veterans in particular because they came back with post-traumatic stress syndrome and they felt disassociated from American life. So he hosts these radio programs to re-immerse them in American life and to give them back their identity. But Mrs. Bethune, because of who she was and such a vastly important person, he did that for her. And unfortunately, we don't have the recording, we only have the transcripts of the program. So here you see Mrs. Bethune wearing the Haitian Medal of Honor that she received on her neck. She was very into the bling, as you all want to call it. She loved jewelry. She was always with pearls and attached. And this is probably how you see her if you were to say, well, who is that? You know, say Mrs. Bethune or Dr. Bethune. Because we always see her as a gray-headed person. We need to see her as a young person, as someone who was eventually a child. We need to see her in all phases. And beside her is Dorothy Ferebee. Now, Mrs. Bethune was not physically taller. She was standing on the dais. And it's a power move. So if anybody wants to be a powerful person, make sure you get the person that your subordinate, make sure they understand their subordinate. I thought that was very interesting. But because I think Mrs. Bethune was so captivating and that she was so successful at producing outcome, people such as Dr. Ferebee, who had an earned MD, would subordinate herself to someone who did not even have a college degree. Mrs. Bethune did not go to college. She went to Moody Bible School, which is a seminary, which we would now call probably a certificate program, but she did not have a formal college degree. And she had since received honorary doctorates, but she preferred Mrs. Bethune. That is how she preferred to be addressed, because she wanted the honor of being called Mrs. One white person at the White House said, "Hey, auntie," you know, that was auntie or boy, whatever they would call you as a moniker during the time. And she made it, she drew back and said, "I don't know which one of my siblings' sons you are. Please clarify." So no cussing, no neck roll, no eye popping, just very clearly. So which one of my siblings' children are you? Okay, and she had 16 siblings, so it could have been possible. But nevertheless, she wanted to make it clear you put a handle on it. So ladies, you need to put a handle on it. Miss, no yo. And you young men take it too. I have nephews. Let them put a handle on it. You touch my nephew like that. No, back up. Okay. So at any rate, it's very important for us to understand too that she understood the youth, the importance of the youth. And I love this because it was a letter that was written to her in 1948 by the junior NCNW. And it says, "It's with a mingled feeling of surprise and elation that we learned of our privilege of visiting the White House with you this coming Tuesday. How can we thank you enough? We fear words cannot express fully our sincere appreciation of your kindness and thoughtfulness. A kind heart is a fountain of gladness, making everything in its vicinity freshen into smiles." I think it's such a poignant way to kind of, these young women thanking her. And I'm meeting some of these women who were in that junior league in 48, and maybe some of you might also. So, and lastly, Washington memory. In Washington, Bethune left mingled feelings of surprise and elation for the black residents. Her stature and sincerity touched diplomats, ambassadors, university presidents, foreign citizens, military servicemen, students, teachers, blue-collar workers, and government workers. She exuded the confidence and articulate voice of the race. Her ebony face framed in gray hair allowed her visible accessibility in looking personally familiar while simultaneously internationally known. Our collective inheritance, the Council House, is a tourist destination as well as the home of the National Archives of Black Women's History. Bethune's memorial continues to breathe life into new generations, inspiring them to pursue education and engage in activism to safeguard democracy for themselves, the less fortunate, and the unborn. Let it be not said that we dedicate this building to Negro womanhood alone. For if democracy is to be a reality in our beloved America, white women, black women, red women, yellow women must find their way through these doors and approach world problems under the guidance of Almighty God. This is the cover of the book, and this actually was an oil painting done by a man in his 70s. And when I asked him to let me use it, he said, "Well, I'll let you use it on one contingency. Give me a copy of the book." He said, "I'm a white man from the Midwest. I've been born in America. I never heard of her. I'm in my 70s. And he said, when I was commissioned to do this and learning about her, I was just dumbfounded. How could this person exist in my century? And I never heard of her. So he got a copy of the book. I got the chance to use it. And it's a very lovely picture because it really helps you understand her vision. And you see her eyes and, of course, the young women behind her who are always coming up. So thank you. And I look forward to your questions and answers them.
Today we had the opportunity to listen to Dr. Ida E. Jones, author of Mary McLeod Bethune in Washington, D.C., Activism and Education in Logan Circle. For BSU TV, I am Micaiah Smith.